After restoring power during a storm, I came home soaked and exhausted. A guy opened the door and said, "Man, rough night?" When my fiancé realized who he was talking to. The storm started before sunset and never really stopped. Wind slammed into the coast hard enough to bend streetlights and scatter branches like broken bones across the roads. By midnight, half the district had gone dark, and my phone would not stop vibrating with outage alerts, escalation notices, and updates from crews stuck behind fallen lines. I had been awake since the previous morning, running on gas station coffee and adrenaline, moving from site to site with rain soaking through every layer of clothing I owned. I supervised power restoration for the Eastern Grid, which meant responsibility without rest when things went wrong. Hospitals, shelters, water stations, and emergency housing all depended on us. That night was not about comfort or pride. It was about keeping people alive while the weather tried to rip the city apart. Around 4 a.m, we finally stabilized the last critical feeder. The hospital complex came back online. Backup generators powered down cleanly, and my crew looked like ghosts under the floodlights. Mud-streaked faces, shaking hands, exhausted silence. I signed off the clearance forms from the hood of my truck while rain slid down the windshield in uneven sheets. I remember thinking about my house as I drove back, about the heat, the shower, the dry clothes waiting inside. I had texted my fiancée, Rebecca Sloan, hours earlier to tell her not to wait up, that the storm response would take all night. She had replied quickly, telling me to be safe, telling me she loved me. The message felt routine at the time, familiar, reassuring. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sky had lightened just enough to show the damage. Broken fencing, a neighbor's trash can scattered halfway down the block, a tree split down the middle like it had been struck by something angry. Our townhouse stood intact, porch light on, windows dark. It looked calm, almost staged, like a photograph taken before something went wrong. I climbed the steps slowly. My boots were heavy with water. My jacket clung to my back. I reached for the doorbell out of habit, then stopped and used my key instead. The lock turned, but the door did not open. Something pressed against it from the inside. Before I could react, the door opened toward me. A man stood there barefoot, wearing socks that did not match and a gray hoodie I recognized instantly. It was mine. The hood hung loose around his neck, damp hair pressed flat against his forehead like he had just showered. He held a coffee mug in one hand, steam still rising from it. He looked at me, took in the soaked jacket, the mud, the exhausted posture, and smiled in a way that suggested casual sympathy rather than alarm. "Man, rough night?" The words landed before my mind caught up with what my eyes were seeing. For a fraction of a second, I thought I had the wrong house. The storm, the fatigue, the darkness all blurred together, and my brain tried to find a reasonable explanation. But the doorframe was familiar. The chipped paint near the hinge was something I had meant to fix for months. The welcome mat had a burn mark from a dropped cigarette years earlier. This was my house. The man stepped back slightly, still holding the mug, as if making room for me to come inside. He did not recognize me. That detail mattered more than the hoodie, more than the coffee, more than the fact that he had answered my door. I stepped forward and crossed the threshold. The living room lights were on low, casting a warm glow over furniture I had assembled myself. Shoes were lined neatly by the wall, including a pair that did not belong to me. A jacket hung over the back of a chair, unfamiliar in cut and color. The smell of food lingered in the air, something reheated recently, something eaten without hurry. Behind the man, Rebecca stood near the kitchen counter. She was barefoot too. Her hair was tied back in the loose way she wore it at home. She held a dish towel in her hands, twisting it slowly, eyes fixed on me like she was trying to understand whether I was real. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Her face changed in stages. Confusion gave way to recognition. Recognition collapsed into panic, and panic froze into something carefully blank. She did not scream. She did not move. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The man turned his head to follow my gaze. He looked at her, then back at me, finally noticing the tension in the room. Something wrong? I reached behind me and closed the door. The click of the lock sounded louder than the storm outside. The man's expression shifted, not to fear yet, but to uncertainty. He took another sip from the mug and frowned, as if the temperature of the coffee had suddenly changed. I told him to put the mug down. My voice sounded calm to my own ears, which surprised me. He hesitated, then set it on the counter without argument. I asked him who he was. He gave his first name, Owen Pike, and gestured vaguely around the house as if that answered the question. He explained that he was staying here for a bit, that the storm had made things complicated, that Rebecca had offered him a place until things settled down. His explanation came easily, practiced, like he had told this story before. Rebecca said nothing. I asked him how long he had been staying here. He shrugged and guessed at a number that immediately contradicted itself. A week, maybe 2. Hard to tell with the storm, with work, with schedules all over the place. I asked him where he thought I was. He paused, then said he thought I worked out of town. Some kind of long rotation job. Emergency response, maybe. He glanced at Rebecca again, this time with a trace of confusion, like a student realizing the answer he memorized no longer fit the question. I asked Rebecca why a stranger had my hoodie. She finally spoke, but the words came out wrong, out of order, full of qualifiers that did not connect. She said the power had been out earlier. She said it was cold. She said Owen had needed something dry. I asked her why he had a key. That question changed the room. Owen straightened slightly. Rebecca's hands stopped twisting the towel. She said it was temporary. She said she meant to tell me. She said the storm had made everything complicated. I walked past them and into the bedroom. The bed was made, but not carefully. Pillows were arranged in a way I did not recognize. One side of the mattress showed signs of recent use, the sheet wrinkled differently than the other. On the nightstand, my charger was plugged into a phone that was not mine. In the bathroom, a second toothbrush sat in the cup beside mine, still damp. This was not a mistake made in panic during a storm. This was not shelter offered in desperation. I returned to the living room and asked Owen where he usually slept. He pointed toward the bedroom without thinking. Rebecca closed her eyes. I told Owen to sit down. He obeyed, slowly now, the realization beginning to settle. I asked him when he first met Rebecca. He gave a timeline that overlapped with weeks I knew I had been home, weeks we had eaten dinner together, weeks she had talked about wedding planning and venue deposits. When I corrected him, when I told him who I was, the color drained from his face. He said he had not known. He said she told him we were finished. He said she told him the house was hers. Rebecca tried to interrupt, but the words tangled again. Nothing she said aligned with the evidence scattered through the room. Grocery receipts on the counter listed items I never bought. A calendar on the fridge showed notes written in her handwriting on days I remembered clearly. The storm outside had quieted to a steady rain. I asked Owen to leave. He stood up, unsteady now, looking at Rebecca like he expected instruction. She did not give it. He collected his shoes, avoided my eyes, and stepped outside into the wet morning without another word. I locked the door again. Rebecca began to talk quickly, filling the space with explanations that shifted even as she spoke. She referenced stress, loneliness, fear during storms, my absences, her uncertainty about the future. Each sentence contradicted the one before it. I listened without responding. When she finally stopped, I asked her one question. How long had she planned this? She did not answer. That silence told me more than anything she had said all night. Outside, a utility truck rumbled past, heading toward another outage, another call, another place where people were waiting for the lights to come back on. I stood in my own living room, soaked, exhausted, and fully aware that the storm had not caused the damage I was looking at. It had only revealed it. The morning did not slow down after Owen left. The rain eased into a steady drizzle, but the house stayed tense, filled with the quiet hum of appliances and the faint vibration of traffic returning to normal. I did not sit down. I did not change clothes. I stood near the kitchen counter while Rebecca moved through the space in small, careful steps, like someone afraid to disturb a fragile structure she hoped was still standing. She kept talking, not loudly, not emotionally, but persistently, as if volume and repetition could turn confusion into truth. Her explanations shifted in direction every few sentences. One moment, it was loneliness caused by my work schedule. The next, it was a misunderstanding that grew too large to correct. Then it became something she claimed she was planning to fix before I found out. I watched instead of responding. The house told a clearer story than she did. It had rhythms that no storm could fake. The trash bin under the sink held packaging from food I never ate. The refrigerator shelves were rearranged to fit items I never bought. A set of keys hung on the hook by the door that did not belong to me, placed there with familiarity rather than caution. Rebecca said Owen had nowhere else to go during the storm. I opened the calendar on the fridge. The dates were marked weeks back, notes written in her handwriting. Some were errands, some were reminders, and some were names. One of them was Owen's, circled on a day when the weather had been clear and my truck had been parked in the driveway. That was when the tempo changed. I asked her how long he had been using the house while I was gone. She hesitated, then gave a range that made no sense when compared to the calendar. I asked her how often neighbors had seen him. She claimed rarely, which contradicted the familiarity I had already noticed in the way the shoes were placed and the way he had opened the door without hesitation. I stepped outside and walked next door. Mrs. Halvorson had lived there longer than anyone on the block. She answered the door wrapped in a sweater, power restored but heater still running. She looked surprised to see me home so early, then relieved. She said she had wondered when I would be back. She said she had seen the young man coming and going for a while now, usually in the evenings, sometimes in the mornings. She assumed he was family. She assumed Rebecca had told me. I thanked her and returned home without argument or confrontation. Rebecca asked where I had gone. I told her I had spoken to the neighbor. She stopped talking entirely after that. I moved through the house again, this time with intention. The spare closet held more than it should. Clothes folded with casual confidence. Shoes arranged by size. A duffel bag pushed to the back with a work logo stitched onto the side. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to a subcontractor company that occasionally supported emergency response crews during large-scale outages. That detail mattered. Rebecca worked in logistics. She handled scheduling, paperwork, and vendor coordination for a private firm that frequently interfaced with municipal contracts. She knew how storms created gaps in oversight. She knew how emergency status accelerated approvals. She knew how to move people quietly when everyone else was too busy reacting to notice. I asked her where she had met Owen. She said through work. That answer landed heavier than the rest. She said he had been brought on temporarily to assist with overflow response during storm season. She said he needed housing closer to the grid sites. She said she was helping him as a favor, nothing more. I asked her why he believed the house belonged to her alone. She said she had not corrected him. That omission was not accidental. It was structural. I asked her why she had told people I worked out of town. She said it was easier. The house was no longer just a place where an affair happened. It was infrastructure. It had been repurposed, scheduled, and shared. I checked my phone and reviewed my recent deployment logs. Long shifts, overnight responses, multi-day rotations. Every absence lined up neatly with markings on the calendar and receipts in the trash. There was no overlap that suggested panic or poor judgment. Everything suggested planning. Rebecca said she had felt disconnected from me. I asked her why she had continued planning the engagement party during that same period. Why she had sent deposit confirmations. Why she had discussed future renovations with contractors. She did not answer. Instead, she asked if we could sit down and talk calmly. I told her we already were. She tried to redirect, suggesting counseling, time apart, space to think. I asked her why she had never created that space before moving another person into our home. She said she had not known how to tell me. That answer failed under its own weight. I called Owen later that afternoon. Not to confront him, but to clarify facts. He answered reluctantly, his voice tight, already defensive. I asked him how long he believed he had been staying in the house. His timeline extended back further than Rebecca had admitted. He said she told him I had moved out months ago. He said she told him the storm work was my way of avoiding closure. He said she told him the engagement was something she had not known how to cancel publicly. I ended the call without commentary. By evening, the house felt different. Not emptier, but exposed. Every object seemed to belong to a narrative I had not agreed to participate in. Rebecca moved through rooms gathering small items, then setting them down again, unable to commit to leaving or staying. I asked her whether anyone else believed her version of events. She said her parents knew pieces of it. I asked her which pieces. She said enough to think I was unreliable. That admission connected threads I had not yet considered. Missed calls during deployments. Passive comments from family gatherings. Subtle questions framed as concern rather than accusation. The affair had not been isolated. It had been supported by a narrative designed to make me absent even when I was present. As night fell, my phone buzzed again. Not an outage alert this time, but a message from a colleague asking whether I had approved a recent vendor housing request tied to emergency funds. The timing matched too closely to ignore. I told him I had not. Rebecca watched my face as I read the message. She said nothing, but her posture shifted. The room felt smaller. The storm response was winding down across the district. Audits would follow. Reimbursements would be reviewed. Temporary approvals would become permanent records. I realized then that this situation was no longer contained within my personal life. It had crossed into my professional one. The house had not just sheltered an affair. It had anchored a scheme that depended on my absence, my authority, and my silence. I told Rebecca I needed her to leave the house that night. She asked where she would go. I told her she had already figured that out weeks ago. She packed a bag slowly, choosing items with care, avoiding the spare closet entirely. She did not argue. She did not plead. She left before midnight, taking the keys she had given out without permission. I locked the door behind her. Outside, crews continued restoring power to neighborhoods further inland. The city moved forward, lights returning street by street. Inside the house, everything remained illuminated, fully functional, and permanently altered. The storm had passed. The exposure had not. And the question was no longer whether I had been betrayed. It was how much damage had been done while I was busy keeping the lights on. The next morning began with routine that felt counterfeit. I showered, changed clothes, and drank coffee at the kitchen counter where Owen had stood less than 24 hours earlier. Outside, the street looked normal again. Power was restored, traffic had resumed, and the storm already felt like something the city was trying to forget. The house did not cooperate with that effort. It held too many recent adjustments, too many small signs of a life that had been running parallel to mine without intersecting. I reported to the operations office before sunrise. The storm response was officially over, which meant paperwork, audits, and quiet scrutiny would follow. Emergency work always triggered reviews. Temporary authorizations were revisited. Vendor contracts were reconciled. Housing reimbursements were checked line by line. I had been through the process before, which was why the message from my colleague the previous night had not left my mind. I requested access to the emergency housing approvals tied to the storm. The request itself raised no suspicion. Supervisors reviewed these files regularly. What mattered was how quickly patterns appeared once I started reading. Owen's name surfaced more than once. Not prominently, not in a way that suggested intent at first glance, but consistently enough to feel deliberate. Temporary lodging near grid sites. Fuel stipends. Equipment transport credits. Each approval carried my department's authorization code, entered during windows when I had been logged in remotely, often from a truck or a field terminal. That detail narrowed the possibilities. Rebecca had never had direct access to my credentials. She did not need them. She had access to the process. She knew which approvals required oversight and which were waved through during emergency status. She knew how to route paperwork so it appeared routine. She knew which delays would never be questioned during a storm. I forwarded the files to compliance without commentary, not as an accusation, as a request for review. By mid-morning, Owen called me again. He did not start with apologies this time. He asked what was happening. He said his supervisor had contacted him about discrepancies. He said his temporary contract had been suspended pending clarification. I asked him what Rebecca had told him about the funding. He hesitated long enough to answer the question without speaking. He said she told him it was standard. He said she told him my department handled everything. He said she told him I had approved it already. I told him that was not true. That was when the tone of the conversation changed. His voice tightened, not with anger, but with fear. He said he had trusted her. He said he had assumed the house, the money, and the approvals were all part of the same arrangement. He said he had believed he was stepping into something already resolved. I ended the call and returned to the files. The deeper I looked, the more consistent the pattern became. No single approval stood out as criminal on its own. Together, they formed a structure that relied on repetition and invisibility. Small amounts. Temporary designations. Names that would disappear once the storm was archived as history. That afternoon, compliance requested a meeting. They did not accuse me. They asked questions. Calm ones. Procedural ones. Where had I been logged in from during specific approvals? Who had access to my devices during deployments? Whether I recognized the vendor names tied to certain reimbursements. I answered honestly and completely. I told them my fiancée worked in logistics. I told them she had been coordinating with vendors during the storm. I told them I had discovered she had been allowing a subcontractor to stay in my home under false pretenses. That was the first time her name entered the record. The room shifted slightly after that. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. This was no longer a matter of administrative error. It was now a potential conflict of interest with documented financial implications. I returned home that evening to a message from Rebecca waiting on my phone. She said she needed to explain. She said things had gone too far. She said she never intended for money to be involved the way it had become. I did not respond. Later that night, her parents arrived unannounced. They stood on the porch with expressions practiced for concern, not confrontation. They asked to come in. I allowed it. They sat at the table where Rebecca and I had planned seating arrangements weeks earlier. They spoke carefully. They said Rebecca had been under stress. They said the storm had created confusion. They said misunderstandings had compounded. I told them compliance was reviewing emergency funds linked to the house. Their composure faltered. They asked whether this could be handled privately. They asked whether things could be resolved without formal escalation. They asked what I wanted. I told them I wanted the truth documented and the process followed. They left shortly after that. The following day, Rebecca attempted to contact my supervisor directly. She framed me as unstable after prolonged storm exposure. She suggested I had been paranoid, controlling, erratic. She implied my work had affected my judgment. That attempt backfired almost immediately. My supervisor requested documentation. Deployment logs contradicted her claims. Badge access records showed consistent behavior. Field reports were time-stamped and verified by multiple crew leads. The narrative she tried to introduce did not align with the data. By the end of the week, formal notices were issued. Owen's subcontracting privileges were revoked pending investigation. Rebecca was placed on leave by her employer after questions arose about her involvement in vendor coordination during the storm. The house felt quieter during that time. Not peaceful, but still. I slept on the couch. I avoided the bedroom. I focused on work and process because emotion did not move anything forward. Another call came from Owen, this time with a different tone entirely. He said he had been advised to cooperate. He said he had documentation, messages, instructions, timelines. He said Rebecca had coached him on what to say if questions were raised. He said she had told him which approvals were automatic and which ones would never be reviewed closely. He asked what would happen to him. I told him that depended on what he chose to provide. He provided everything. Compliance escalated the matter beyond internal review. Insurance investigators became involved. Emergency funds were frozen pending reconciliation. What had started as a domestic betrayal now sat firmly within institutional oversight. Rebecca did not return to the house. Her belongings remained boxed in the spare room, untouched. The engagement ring sat where she had left it, on the bathroom counter, next to a sink that no longer reflected a shared future. The storm had ended days ago. The city had moved on. The grid, however, kept records. And so did the people responsible for it. By the time the investigation reached its final phase, the storm felt distant, almost abstract. Streets were repaired. Trees were cleared. Power restoration reports were archived and stamped complete. On the surface, the city had recovered. Underneath that surface, paperwork continued to move, signatures accumulated, and consequences took shape quietly. Compliance did not rush. They never do. They reconstructed timelines using access logs, approval chains, and transaction records that did not care about intentions or emotions. What mattered was sequence. What mattered was authorization. What mattered was who benefited and how often. Rebecca was interviewed formally 2 weeks after she left the house. Her initial approach mirrored the pattern I had already seen. Partial admissions, reframed responsibility, claims of misunderstanding amplified by stress. That strategy collapsed when confronted with documents she did not know existed. Approval requests routed through her workstation. Emails sent during hours she claimed she was elsewhere. Messages to Owen that mapped directly onto reimbursement submissions. The story she had relied on stopped functioning once it met verification. Owen's cooperation shortened the process. He provided communication records, voice messages, and instructions that established intent rather than coincidence. He admitted that he had accepted housing, stipends, and equipment access without verifying authorization because he believed it had already been approved through my department. That belief did not absolve him, but it contextualized his role. His subcontracting license was revoked permanently. Civil recovery claims followed shortly after. He did not contest them. Rebecca's situation unfolded differently. Emergency funds tied to storm response were subject to strict oversight. Misuse did not require large sums to qualify as fraud. It required misrepresentation. It required personal benefit. Both were present. Charges were filed quietly. No press releases. No public spectacle. Her employer terminated her contract, citing violations of compliance standards and misrepresentation of vendor relationships. Her parents attempted to intervene again, this time through legal channels. Their attorney was advised that cooperation would limit exposure. They chose not to escalate. The engagement ended through documentation rather than conversation. Asset separation followed standard procedure. Joint accounts were dissolved. Shared insurance policies were revised. The house remained mine, both legally and practically. Rebecca's remaining belongings were collected by a third party during a scheduled window. She did not return. I transferred divisions within the department after the case closed. Not as punishment, as precaution. Emergency response creates proximity, and proximity invites assumptions. The move protected both my role and the integrity of future operations. My name was cleared formally. A memorandum entered my personnel file noting full cooperation and absence of wrongdoing. That mattered more than any apology could have. Months later, I returned to storm work in another district. Different crews, different terrain, same protocols. The work felt familiar again, grounded in systems that functioned whether or not people did. I learned later that Rebecca relocated to a neighboring state. Employment options narrowed quickly once background checks reflected compliance violations. Insurance claims tied to the house were denied after investigators confirmed false occupancy declarations. The legal process continued without my involvement. There was no final conversation between us. Nothing dramatic. No confrontation staged for closure. That absence felt appropriate. The house eventually settled back into a version of itself that made sense again. Objects returned to places they had occupied before schedules were manipulated around my absence. The spare room emptied. The calendar came down. The fridge no longer held notes that required explanation. I replaced the welcome mat. During another storm months later, while supervising a smaller response, I stood outside a substation watching crews work under portable lights. Rain fell steadily. Radios crackled with updates. The grid responded the way it was designed to, section by section, restoring function without emotion. I realized then that what had happened was not chaos. It was exploitation of predictability. Someone had learned my schedule, my trust, and my systems well enough to misuse them. The storm had not created that vulnerability. It had only exposed it.